Have you ever wondered why some people just keep going long after motivation has completely disappeared, while others, well, they fold, sometimes right when success is just around the corner? Now, this isn't going to be a pep talk. We're not talking about willpower or grit. We're here to deconstruct the mental physics of endurance, the hidden architecture that really determines who persists and who quits when things get tough. So, let's dive in. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to isolate the core signal, the thing that separates elite persistence from just improving. Then, we'll map out the underlying pattern, which is made of 3 key structures. From there, we'll see how this all plays out in high-stakes situations, look at the real cost of operating without it, and define the huge strategic edge it creates. And we'll wrap up with a few sharp questions to help you audit your own system.
All right, let's start with the foundational idea. For the people who seem to never quit, endurance isn't some emotional resource they have to dig deep to find. No, it's an operating system they've already installed.
And this, right here, is where most people get it wrong. We're taught to see persistence as an emotional battle, a matter of willpower, grit, and motivation. But the signal from the top performers tells a completely different story. For them, endurance isn't an emotion, it's architecture. It's a system of rules and identity that they build in advance, and it just runs automatically when feelings like motivation inevitably fail.
This really gets to the heart of the problem. Without that pre-installed system, what are you left with? You're forced to improvise. And when you're under pressure, when you're tired and frustrated, you open up negotiations with yourself. And what's the easiest thing to agree on in that negotiation? Quitting.
So what does this mental architecture actually look like? Well, we see this repeatable pattern across founders, elite athletes, top operators, you name it. And it's built on 3 core structures. This whole architecture rests on 3 pillars. First, having predefined rules. Second, an anchored identity. And third, a relentless focus on compounding progress. So let's break down the mechanics of each one.
The first structure is all about taking emotion out of the equation. See, high performers decide the exact conditions under which they will quit before the pressure even hits. They make that choice when they're in a cold, rational state, so they don't have to rely on a hot, emotional one later on. The decision's already been made. Period.
The second piece is identity. For these people, their actions are completely tied to who they believe they are. This changes the stakes entirely. Suddenly, quitting isn't just about failing at a task. It becomes a direct threat to their self-image. Persistence is the only choice that feels consistent with who they are, which makes it almost inevitable.
And the third structure is momentum. They don't get fixated on some perfect, far-off outcome, because that can feel impossibly distant and discouraging. Instead, they focus on small, consistent wins. That constant forward motion creates this powerful feedback loop that convinces the brain to just keep going, reframing the struggle as simple movement.
Okay, so how does this system actually function out in the real world? Let's take a look at the game itself, where the stakes are high and the timelines are long.
Think about a startup founder deep in the trough of sorrow, long after that initial excitement is gone. Or a writer who's years into working on a novel. It's not passion that gets them through, it's the system. Their rules are set, their identity is on the line, and they just focus on the next small action. That's how they make persistence inevitable.
So what about the flip side? What happens to people who are operating without this pre-built system? Well, the cost is simple. Your commitment becomes completely negotiable. And this is a really critical distinction you have to get. If you're improvising, quitting isn't some moral failing. It's not a bug in your character. It's actually a logical feature. When the cost of effort starts to feel higher than the potential reward, well, exiting the game is the most rational move you can make. I mean, just look at the difference in stability here. A commitment that's driven by motivation is incredibly volatile. It spikes really high, but it always inevitably crashes. But a systems-driven approach, that provides a structural floor. It dramatically lowers your chances of quitting because it just doesn't depend on how you feel on any given day. So who gets left behind in all this? First, you've got the negotiable. Their commitment is always up for debate. Then there are the replaceable, the ones who just opt out as soon as things get uncomfortable. And finally, the mentally fragile, who need constant praise and external rewards to keep going. Without an internal system, they're completely at the mercy of their environment. When you put all this together, the strategic advantage becomes crystal clear. It's not about having more endurance than someone else. It's about having automated endurance. Just look at the operational shift here. The conventional mindset sees pressure and thinks, okay, I have to endure this. The winner's operating system just defaults to, the system handles this.
They don't just hope they succeed. Their very identity is tied to the process. They don't try to focus harder. Their next action is already pre-decided. It's a huge shift from active, draining resistance to an automated response.
All right, enough observation. Let's turn this from watching others to looking at ourselves. How can you start to analyze your own internal operating system? We're going to end with 3 very sharp questions.
First, what would make you stop? Seriously, have you actually defined your quitting conditions? Are they clear, are they rational, and were they decided in advance? Or are they just vague feelings that you'll end up negotiating with yourself when you're tired and beat down?
The second question, who are you when it's hard? When things get really difficult, does your identity act as an anchor, making persistence the only logical conclusion? Or does it become a liability, giving you an easy way to rationalize an exit?
And finally, a question for right now. Forget the giant goal for just a moment. What tiny win could you create today? Because that one small bit of motion, that's the first gear in building the momentum that makes persistence feel less like a struggle and a lot more like an inevitability.